Hey there folks, John here with Through My Lens, and today I'm coming to you with another watch-related video. Today I'm going to be doing a review on the Tudor Black Bay Chronograph. Now this week I got a call from my local authorized dealer that I've been waiting on for 6 months. It's a call that said they finally got a reverse Panda Tudor Black Bay Chronograph in stock. And this is the watch. Now, to understand why I bought the Tudor Black Bay Chronograph, you have to understand my history with the Rolex Daytona. I've owned several Rolex Daytonas, specifically the reference 116520. Now, back in the early 2000 timeframe, this was hands down the hottest sports watch on the market. If you were lucky enough to get a call from your local authorized dealer, who maybe got 1 or 2 in a year, you could walk out the door and nearly double your money on the secondary market. I owned a white dial version for nearly a decade, but found in the later years of ownership I was rarely wearing it. As beautiful as the polished elements found in the watch were, like the center links of the bracelet and the entire surface of the bezel, it was a horrendous scratch magnet. And while the case was incredibly slender for a chronograph, and in the entire execution really looked fantastic with a suit, there is something that's always been a bit smallish looking about the diameter of the case. The Rolex Daytona always looked and wore smaller on the wrist than my larger Submariners. But the biggest deal breaker for me was the lack of a date display. I found myself wearing the watch less and less because it lacked a date display. I ended up selling my last Daytona around 2013, and while I have missed having a chronograph in my collection, and I miss the mystique and prestige of owning a Rolex Daytona, I can't say I've really missed the watch itself. Now let me talk a bit about Tudor as a brand, because the Tudor brand was a significant factor in my decision to buy this watch. Now, earlier this year I did a review of the first luxury watch that I'd purchased in about 10 years, which was the Omega Seamaster 300M. Please go check it out here on Through My Lens. Now in that video I talked about the fact that from about 2000 to 2012 I was an absolutely rabid watch enthusiast, but I sort of burned out on watches and ended up taking a break for about the next 10 years. Now as it turns out, those 10 years between 2012 and 2022 were quite pivotal for Tudor. Now Hans Wilsdorf took over the brand in 1936, and it was his desire to provide his watch dealers with a lower priced option to what was found in the Rolex catalog at the time. A watch that would serve an important purpose and offered pride of ownership without an unattainable price tag. So for many years the Tudor brand existed as sort of a Chevy to the Cadillac that was Rolex. The formula was pretty straightforward. Tudor would borrow parts from the Rolex part bins like cases, bracelets, and crowns and combine them with some Tudor-specific dials, and they used outsourced movements from ETA to keep costs down. This created a perception, particularly in the United States, that Tudor really was nothing more than a poor man's Rolex. The brand definitely had an identity problem, and it seemed both the brand and retailers really didn't know how to market it. So demand for its models waned. And Tudor ceased selling its watches in the UK and America for a number of years, and only returned to the US market in 2013, just 1 year after I sort of walked away from the luxury watch industry. Now, David Serrato, design director at Tudor, hopefully I pronounced his name right, is largely credited with ushering in a new era of creativity for Tudor, and the brand began releasing stunning watches which captured some of the interesting details of its former timepieces. And as I was and remain a huge Rolex fanboy, I've always wanted to get a Tudor in my collection because of the close association with Rolex. I was never a huge fan of the Tudor Submariner alternatives, but I had a huge appreciation for the Oyster date chronograph, and had always thought that one day I would run across one for a good price and pick one up. Tudor released their first chronograph in 1970, which happens to be my birth year as well, the Oyster date chronograph. Now the Oyster date chronograph was a sports watch powered by the manual winding Valjoux 7734 movement. Its 39mm case was bigger than the Rolex Daytona of the day at 36mm, and the design was a little more imposing than the Daytona. Now fast forward to 2017 and Tudor expands its wildly successful flagship Black Bay line with a chronograph which featured what Tudor called an in-house chronograph movement. More on that a little later. The reference 79360N debuted in 2020 alongside the white dial counterpart to this watch, and both are available on either a bracelet or a strap. Now my sense is that the Panda version, the white dial version, is more popular than this reverse Panda model. Now while the appeal of the silvery white dial of the Panda version is not lost on me, and indeed it was a difficult decision, both the aesthetic and the legibility of the reverse Panda in the end won out for me. Now the current Black Bay chronograph often draws comparison with the vintage 6263 Paul Newman dialed Rolex Daytona, which was the inspiration for many past Tudor chronograph designs, including the Tudor Oyster date chronograph, which Tudor redesigned in 1995 as the 792000 series. The redesigned case was more Daytona-esque and a little more refined and rounded. The big change was the presence of a black anodized aluminum insert that replaced the traditional plexiglass tachymeter scale bezel insert, and a sapphire crystal with a cyclops lens was adopted to replace the plexiglass crystal. It was powered by an updated Valjoux 7750 movement. Now it's interesting to note that the Tudor Oyster date received a self-winding chronograph movement about 12 years ahead of the Daytona in 1976. Now the Black Bay Chrono is powered by the Caliber MT5813, featuring a new integrated column wheel chronograph movement. It's a result of an interesting collaboration between Tudor and Breitling. Tudor starts with a Breitling Caliber 01 or B01, which came out in 2009, and they significantly modify it to create the MT5813. Now the MT5813, or Montreux's Tudor 5813, has 41 jewels, a 70-hour power reserve, a silicone freely sprung balance spring that oscillates at a beat speed of 28,800 beats per hour. So it's a high-speed movement. And it's a chronometer-rated movement by the Swiss Koss Institute. Tudor actually certifies that the watch will perform better than Koss parameters at -2 or -2 to +4 seconds per day. The movement features a vertical clutch in its construction, which means that you can run the chronograph secondhand for as long as you want, really, and it will not impact the overall accuracy. It also removes that stuttery, jumpy start and stop of the chronograph secondhand that you'll see on other chronographs which use less sophisticated movements. This movement is widely considered to be one of the best mechanical chronograph movements that can be had for under $10,000 US. Now for better or for worse, Tudor has rebuilt their brand almost entirely on a vintage aesthetic inspired by the best of both Rolex and Tudor from years gone by. Thankfully, the retro styling has been very tastefully done on this watch. The super tall and subtly domed sapphire crystal on this watch has the appearance of a plexiglass crystal. The aluminum bezel insert and matte black dial, the faux rivets on the sides of the bracelet, all hallmark touch points that trace back to both Rolex and Tudor designs of yesteryear. While many aspects of retro or vintage styling usually miss with me, it's really working for me on this watch. I mean, who doesn't love the look of a 6263 Daytona and the Tudor Oyster date? I was really nervous that I would fixate on the snowflake hand, but it really doesn't bother me in the least. Now, Tudor bracelets have been called by many as some of the best in the business at any price, and indeed it is super nice. It's certainly inspired by the Rolex Oyster bracelet, but also different. It tapers quite differently. You can see down toward the bottom. It doesn't taper nearly as aggressively as a Rolex Oyster bracelet. And of course the finish looks different, largely because of the 316L steel type used in the Tudor case and bracelets versus 904L steel used by Rolex. Now the clasp design appears to be a nearly exact duplicate of the Rolex Daytona 116520 that I had 10 years ago right down to the fine adjustment. You can see the deployment very, very similar to the old style Daytona, as well as the fine adjustment in the clasp. Now I'm going to go out on a limb here and make a very controversial statement. The Tudor Black Bay chronograph is often compared with the Rolex Daytona, and many will debate which is better. I've not yet had the opportunity to get hands-on with the latest generation Daytona, but what I will say is that the Black Bay chrono can stand toe-to-toe with the previous generation 116520 Daytona. And it is, in fact, for me, a better watch. Now, back when I was buying Daytonas, they were around $6,000. About $1,000 more expensive than the Black Bay chrono is today, 10 years later. Now, the Rolex Caliber 4130 was Rolex's first in-house chronograph movement and was heralded for having things like a vertical clutch, freely spun balance wheel, and several other high-end features also found in the Black Bay chronograph's MT5813. And rumor does have it that many of the same engineers who developed the Caliber 4130 for Rolex designed the Breitling Caliber B01. Again, the clasp is virtually identical. I give points to the Black Bay chrono for not having polished center links and for having the date display. And I do like the larger size of the reverse Panda dial better than on the Black Bay chrono. The case features beveled edges, which not even Rolex puts on their cases anymore. Yes, the Daytona does have a thinner case profile, and it certainly has a mystique and a panache that no other watch in the world can compete with. But again, compared to the older Daytona, I like this watch better. Now, the Black Bay chrono has been extraordinarily popular, as evidenced by the 6-month wait that it took me to get one from my local authorized dealer. The watch was red hot when it debuted, and demand, it seems, has only grown. Of course, the Black Bay chronograph is not a perfect watch. There are a few things that I would change. Now, the packaging is classic Rolex from 20 years ago, and not in a good way. I'm also surprised that the watch does not have a more contemporary, toothless, fine adjustment in the clasp. The clasp, as good as it is going to be a real scratch magnet, as you can see by all that flat brush surface. The aluminum bezel insert is certainly fitting with the vintage heritage of the watch and the retro design language, but I think I would prefer a ceramic bezel insert that won't fade and take damage like an aluminum one will. But these are very minor criticisms. There are no major faux pas here with this watch. The only other possible point of criticism that I can come up with is that the fact Tudor calls the MT5813 an in-house movement. Now, there's no strict definition of what constitutes an in-house movement, but the Caliber MT5813 just doesn't quite meet my standard. It's certainly a fascinating movement, given that it's a hybrid between Breitling and Tudor. It's incredibly sophisticated with very contemporary features like extremely high shock, temperature, and magnetic resistance, and it has a very high power reserve. But I just don't consider it to be an in-house movement in the same way that I would consider to be a Rolex or Patek Philippe movement. Mainly because it incorporates Breitling-made components. Now, the fact that Tudor movements are made by movement manufacturer Canisi doesn't bother me, because the movement manufacturer was both started by and owned by the same Hans Wilsdorf Foundation that owns both Tudor and Rolex. Much the same way, it really doesn't bother me that Omega's in-house movements are manufactured at ETA facilities. Well, both Omega and ETA are owned by the Swatch Group. Now, some people have a problem with the fact that when Tudor introduced their new chronograph in 2017, they made it part of the Black Bay line, which up until this point had been comprised pretty exclusively of diver-style watches. Now, as much as I understand the criticism, I have to step back and say I understand why Tudor wanted to capitalize on the momentum they created with the Black Bay line when they introduced their chronograph. Yes, I would have much preferred if Tudor had paid homage to their past and called this watch an Oyster date chronograph, even though I understand why that's a really bad idea, because Tudor is trying not to repeat past mistakes and differentiate themselves from Rolex. And clearly, not all Tudor dive watches are Black Bays. I'm looking at you, Pelagos. So even though the Black Bay Chrono has a water resistance rating of 200 meters and screw-down pushers and a screw-down crown, I don't consider it to be a diver chronograph. In the same vein of the Daytona, I consider it to be an all-around sports watch. A very good sports watch. Perhaps one of the best ever made, if not one of the best values in the luxury wristwatch market today. Well, there you have it. There's my review of the Tudor Black Bay chronograph. So far, I'm absolutely over the moon with it and so happy to have a chronograph back in my collection and finally to have a Tudor in my collection as well. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Take care. God bless. We'll see you in the next video.
I hope you've enjoyed this production from the Through My Lens YouTube channel. If you did, please click on the like button and do share the video on social media. If you'd like to see more content like it, please do subscribe to the channel, follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and do check out Through My Lens at www.throughmylens.org.